Alchemy Radio.
Alchemy Radio. Alchemy Radio. Alchemy Radio. Analyze. Conceive. Believe. Are you tuned in?
Hello and welcome to Alchemy Radio, the home of the open mind. Thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you're enjoying the show as we bring you a variety of eye and ear opening guests every 2 weeks. We're increasing the output of the show. We're about to go weekly, so as you've noticed, if you're a regular listener over the last few weeks, we've had extra shows in where normally we would have a 1 week break, and we're continuing to do so. Of course, we're dependent on your donations, and anything that you can donate to help support our bandwidth costs is greatly appreciated. The show is currently free and advertising free, as you know, and it's non-profit as well, so we're very grateful, as I said, for any help that you can offer at all, and thank you indeed to everybody who has donated to date. Check out our new Twitter account, twitter.com/Alchemy Radio, and of course our Facebook page, so get following and interacting with us with all your feedback, guest suggestions and other input. So, onto the show. Today's guest is James Corbett, who edits, webmasters, writes and produces the extremely popular Corbett Report website. James has been living and working in Japan since 2004. He started the Corbett Report in 2007 and has written, recorded and edited over 1,000 hours of audio and video media for the website, including a weekly podcast and several regular online video series. He produces video reports for GRTV, the video production arm of the Centre for Research on Globalisation, and BoilingFrogsPost.com, the website of noted FBI whistleblower Sibel Edmonds. He is also an editorial writer for the International Forecaster, the weekly e-newsletter created by the recently deceased economic analyst Bob Chapman. James, you're very welcome to Alchemy Radio. How are things?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you on. Myself and all the Alchemy Radio crew have been big followers of your work, and some of the stuff you've done has been truly magnificent and really eye-opening for us over the last number of years. So before we delve into some of that knowledge, tell us a little bit about how you got into this field and how you rejected a lot of the mainstream in favour of the Corbett Report.
Well, do you want the short version or the long version?
Well, we've all the time in the world, so I'll allow you to decide
Well,
that.
let's start with the short version, and you can ask me for details on any parts that you need more information on.
Great.
I mean, the short version of this story is that it was about 2006, and I was here in Japan, where for the audience who doesn't know, I'm a Canadian citizen. I live in Japan. I've been living here since 2004. I originally came out here just to teach English for a year and see a bit of Asia, and 1 year turned into 2 years, turned into 3 years, turned into 9, going on 10 years. So, and now I have a Japanese wife and child, so it looks like this might be my home. And at any rate, so it was 2006. I'd been living in Japan a couple of years, and I, for the first time, was moving into my own apartment after having shared with some flatmates, I suppose you would say, in Ireland for a while. And so I was moving into my own apartment, and it came with an internet connection. And this was the first time in years that I'd had an internet connection in my home. Generally, I'd had to go to internet cafes to check emails or whatever up until that point. So it was quite a breakthrough for me, and especially so because during the time that I hadn't had the internet, some new kind of file sharing and video sharing sites had come along, like YouTube and Google Video, and suddenly I was able to watch all these feature-length documentaries on all sorts of different subjects, and that was so revolutionary for me because I think it was what I'd always wanted and always thought, why didn't this exist? I mean, back in the old days of the television paradigm, as I'm sure some of your listeners might be able to remember, basically we were all just subject to whatever the programmers of the television station wanted us to see, and suddenly I was able to follow my own interests and follow that around the web and research basically anything I was interested in. And I've always been interested in politics and things of that nature, and considered myself well informed on these types of issues. So, of course, I started looking at those types of documentaries and things along those lines. And it wasn't long before, in the related section of the YouTube videos, I started seeing these links to these 9/11 truth-related videos. And at the time, I was very much adverse to the idea of 9/11 truth. I thought it was a ridiculous conspiracy theory, and how people make conspiracies out of anything, and why would they talk about this, and it's disrespectful, and all of the type of things that I'm sure everyone who listens to this program has probably heard from others if they haven't said it themselves. But it kept coming up in the related sections, and I every time now and then I'd click on some of the videos, and just through that process I came across ridiculous videos that made silly claims that I immediately was able to dismiss. But then I came across other videos that made interesting claims that I hadn't heard before, and when I went to look up some of the information, I found it was actually true. So I started finding out more about Osama bin Laden and what the Al-Qaeda network really was and how it came to be and things of that nature. And the more I started to involve myself in that process and start to try to challenge some of the claims that I was seeing in these videos, the more obviously I became involved in going down that rabbit hole that, again, I'm sure a lot of your audience can probably relate to. And so it was through that process that I eventually came out, I guess, the other side to where I am today. And basically it was a process of going through 9/11 Truth and then finding out about central banking and what's really behind the money supply and all of that. And I think that was when the penny really dropped for me and I realized what was going on. And that's also when I realized the scope of the lies that I'd been exposed to for basically my entire life. I mean, again, I considered myself a fairly well-informed person, but there was all this information I was encountering that I had never, ever been exposed to in all my many years of schooling and serious deep thought and contemplation of these important issues. I'd never been exposed to this type of information, so it really did throw me for a loop at first. And I think it was just the extent of the discrepancy between this information I was encountering versus what I'd been taught my whole life was just so jarring that I figured there had to be some way for me to I guess help spread this information to others, because it had such a profound effect on me. And I knew that it was just people like myself just putting this online that helped me to come to that process of realization myself. So I wanted to be part of that. And lo and behold, I started up the Corbett Report website just as a podcast. That was just the original idea. I was just going to do a podcast, and never in a million years would I have ever expected it would have become what it did. But I guess that's the lesson that I like to try to spread to others, is you never ever know what's going to come of your endeavors, or if you plant the seeds today, what's going to flower 5, 10, 20 years from now. You have no idea how this is going to ripple out. So I think it's important, incumbent for all of us who do have information that is important in breaking down some of the walls and barriers that have been erected around our minds our entire lives, to use this brief window of opportunity of the internet to really affect that. So that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I've been doing for the last 6, going on 7 years now at the Corbett Report, and hopefully will continue to do as long as it takes. And I don't see an end to a lot of the lies or deceptions coming anytime soon, unfortunately.
I don't think so, but I must say one of, to my mind anyway, one of the big secrets to your success, I think the way that you interpret the news and the way that you present it then, repackage and present it to people in such, I suppose, a non-conspiratorial manner, if you get my drift. While you may be speaking about conspiracies a lot of the time, it's presented in such a way that people are familiar with, a format and a style that people who mightn't have had their own paradigms shattered at a particular stage are open to. And I think that's one of the big attractions. And that's certainly when I first became aware of the Corbett Report. I remember sitting down with one of my mates and watching a couple of videos and thinking, hang on a minute, this guy gets it. And not only does he get it, he knows how to present it to people who haven't been exposed to this information before. Because I know for a lot of people, if they're presented with paradigm-shattering news, they can kind of curl up in a ball, so to speak, and they can resist. But the way things are presented on the Corbett Report that's really attractive to me, and I think certainly is to a lot of other people, is that it can spark a kernel for people. They can walk away from a report and they can kind of maybe come back to it and think, do you know what, there was something in there. Even though that news seems so far out to me, there was something in there that I can relate to. Let's go back to it. And that's one of the things I found myself going back and back to your information. Have you got that kind of feedback from others at any stage?
Well, I thank you for that feedback. It's always good to hear how people respond to the work and why they are attracted to it. And I think it's different for everyone. And I have heard similar stories from people before. I mean, there's a lot of different people who listen, I'm sure, for different reasons. But I can't really say that any of this has been any sort of conscious effort on my part. It really is just an organic offshoot of the work that I do and the person that I am. And I'm just the type of person that I would rather, I mean, if someone's going to be presenting me with some startling ideas and facts and claims, I would really like to see the sources and see the documentation and see where they're getting this from. And that was always the driving motivation behind what I was doing. In fact, from the very, very, very beginning, even before I started the website, as soon as I had the idea of doing a podcast, one of the very first things that came to me was that it was going to have, every single time I mentioned an article or whatever, it was going to be documented, and I'd have a link to it so that people could find it very easily. And that's always been a core part of what I'm doing, because I don't see myself really as someone who's out there trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm not sitting there saying, oh, please believe me. I'm saying these are the facts that I have. These are the sources that I use to get those facts. These are the ways that I'm interpreting those facts. This is the way I see it. And if people see it the similar way, great. If they see it a different way, well, certainly that's up to their prerogative. The only thing that I really ask of my audience is that they don't take my word for it. They don't just believe, that they do look at the sources and consider things for themselves. And if the audience is doing that, I consider what I'm doing successful, whether they believe what I'm saying or not. So I think I approach it from maybe a slightly different perspective than a lot of people out there seem to at least think that a lot of broadcasters approach their work. Again, I'm not trying to form a cult. I'm not trying to make people believe what I believe. I'm just putting out facts, and people can take them for what they're worth.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, and I certainly commend that personally. So keep up the good work in that regard. So let's talk about 9/11 for a second, James, because you mentioned it. You mentioned that it was kind of the big one for you, as it was for a lot of people, with regard to opening your mind and your eyes to what was really going on. And I think it coincided with the boom on the internet. I mean, the timing of 9/11 couldn't have been worse for any perceived control system, in my opinion, because of the way the internet was really taking hold and becoming a daily fixture in people's lives. So what was it about 9/11? What was the smoking gun for you? I mean, a lot of people will be familiar with your 9/11 A Conspiracy Theory video, which has done so well, and it has opened up your work to a lot of people. But was there a particular smoking gun, or was it kind of a drip feed process with regard to 9/11?
I don't think there was a single smoking gun. I guess it was more just accumulation of facts. But there were steps and stages in that process. I mean, I remember after, I believe it was 9/11 Mysteries, which was a documentary. I think it was going to be a documentary series, but I believe there was only one that was ever made, and it was about the destruction of the towers. And I remember watching that, and then after that point, I remember actually sitting there at work one day. I was doing some mindless paperwork, and my mind was drifting, and I was sort of picturing in my head the way those buildings collapsed, and I started to realize that I couldn't imagine how I ever believed that they simply collapsed before. When you look at it from the perspective of, well, there was something definitely very different going on there, you start to see the way it was basically pulverizing and being torn apart in midair. And you can't unsee that once you've seen it. And it really struck me how for all those years I'd just been seeing it, and just I heard the word collapse, and so that's what I saw. But then once I started to consider it in that different light, I couldn't believe that I ever saw it that way. So that was one of the things that struck me in the early part of the research. But for myself, I think I've always been more interested and drawn to some of the geopolitical ties and connections, the ideas of the Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda network, what it is, how it was founded, the ways that it was being pursued by certain parts of the intelligence community and then covered up by other parts so that their actions could continue, and some of the spy games and shadow games. I think certainly the actual war games that were taking place on that day, that was another huge piece of the puzzle for me. And then something that I've always been particularly fascinated by is the kind of financial aspects of 9/11, because I really do think that on one level, I mean, I don't think it was just an event that was just one thing and done for one purpose by one group. I think, like any of these spectacular events, there were a number of different ideas and players and agendas that converge at this point, and it worked out for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. So I don't ever try to pin it down to just one thing, and Cheney with a plunger, in order to invade Afghanistan. I think there was a lot of different things that were going on, but one of them definitely was the plundering of billions, and I guess in the long run trillions of dollars from the economic system through what took place on 9/11 directly, and then through its aftermath. And it's interesting to me to to see all of the different threads of the different financial aspects of what was happening on 9/11 itself. When you look at all of the financial firms that had their headquarters in World Trade Center, and then you start to find out about, for example, the recovered hard drives, that there was a German firm that was working on actually recovering those hard drives, recovering the data from them, and they started to uncover the fact that there was, I believe it was tens or perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars in anomalous transactions that they were able to trace from those recovered hard drives before the point that their investigation seems to have been shut down and nothing was heard from it ever again. They had only, I think, looked at something like 25 or 30% of the recovered hard drives at that point, so there was still a lot of data left to go through, but we never heard anything about that investigation after those initial findings were reported, I believe in 2002, maybe 2003, that report made its way out. And so that's just one of the many aspects of the financial side of 9/11. But those are the types of things. And it was just a confluence of all of these different facts that, again, the more I tried to challenge them and look into them, the more I found that there was something to them. And that was disturbing, obviously, but it was very... I guess it was the process of me investing myself in that research and putting sort of my time and energy into the research that got me to the point where I am today, which is why I think that you're exactly right. In terms of 9/11 happening right there, sort of at the rise of the internet in popular culture, it is a fascinating period of time, because I think the internet enables a different way for people to relate to information, to access information, to understand and process information than has really ever existed in human history. I tend to stress that a lot in my work, and I don't want to people to just dismiss that as people saying, oh, he's just temporocentric. He only thinks, his own time is the most important time. But I really do think there's something fundamentally different happening with this internet revolution. I mean, I really think there is the potential for a revolution in consciousness in a meaningful way that's happening right now, because people are able to not just access information in kind of a passive way, but to actively insert themselves in that process. And I think there's a different outcome that comes from us actively being a part of that engagement. And I hope that it doesn't all get shunted off into kind of diversionary avenues. I hope that the internet doesn't just basically become Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Google, so that everybody goes to these few sites where all of the information is controlled and you have to sign up for a user account that can be censored and blocked at any time for any reason, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I hope we can avoid that fate for the internet, because I really do think that there is a potential for a true change that's happening right now. And my process of coming to understand, for example, 9/11 was just one small piece of that much bigger puzzle.
I think so, and I think it's very interesting what you say about the internet, almost like an alternative hive mind, and if it provided it's not allowed to be controlled in the way that we fear, or the way that you've just mentioned, it's almost like, having spoken to a lot of alternative historians over the last couple of years, a lot of people will talk about ancient indigenous cultures around the world and lost civilizations, and how they appear to have had some method of communication that went beyond technology, that was lost at some point in human history. And for me, while I don't know a huge amount about that side of things, the internet, when I hear people speak about the internet, such as the way you just have, it reminds me of that kind of almost like a remembering of a lost consciousness, or a lost technology, for want of a far better word, that we can suddenly access this cache of information that's held for everybody at any stage around the world. And it breaks down massive borders, which can be a very dangerous thing, as any kind of technology can, but I think an overridingly positive thing, because of the way that it just gives people access to different opinions, to allow them to form their own opinions for the first time in many years. Because you spoke earlier on about the old television situation, whereby people would pick up a newspaper, look at the television, and that's the only access they had to information, bar the few books that they might be able to access in a library. And they had this very small, narrow bandwidth of information that has just exploded with an uncontrolled and an uncensored internet. So yes, I hope also that things don't go down the censored route, because I think that would be an absolute disaster for the expanding human consciousness that I think is developing, and developing a lot more quickly over time. And there's a snowball effect with regard to it, as the internet takes a grip and a hold, as it has over the last decade or 2 decades. So you also mentioned money, James, and following the money trail with regard to 9/11, and it goes far, far further and deeper than that as well. I mean, we're looking at a global mirrored economy all over the place with the economic crashes of 2008 and 2009, and the way there seems to be a huge transference of wealth from the many to the few that appears to be unprecedented in Roman history. There was something similar with the Romans way back when. But what's your take on the global economy and the way things have gone over the last, I suppose, since 9/11? And what way are things headed in the future, in your opinion?
Well, I think 9/11 certainly did provide a kind of inflection point in the economy, and it's interesting. Obviously, right at the point of the popping of the .com bubble, we had the second strike, I guess, on the economy was 9/11, and obviously everyone was thinking, well, what on earth does this mean? I mean, it hit again right at the heart of the financial center at Wall Street and World Trade Center. I mean, obviously it was symbolically important, it was economically important, it was a huge hit. So how on earth will the United States react? And of course, they reacted by cutting interest rates to basically nothing and keeping them there for an extended period of time, which of course inflated the housing bubble. And then the housing bubble, of course, we all know the popping of that, which led to the downfall of Bear Stearns, then Lehman Brothers, and then the kind of global financial meltdown. And of course, that has only been put off and sustained by the unbelievable opening of the floodgates of, first of all, the bailouts. I mean, I was just once again refreshing my memory on the bailouts and where all of this money was going, and again, just looking at the Government Accountability Office review of Federal Reserve System data from December 1st, 2007 to July 21st, 2010, and they had $16.1 trillion in bailouts going to Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, Barclays, Bear Stearns, Goldman Sachs, Royal Bank of Scotland, Deutsche Bank, UBS, JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, Lehman Brothers. I mean, all of these institutions receiving trillions in the case of Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Merrill Lynch, and Bank of America, and hundreds of billions in the case of all of the rest of those banks and many more. And just staggering sums of money being handed out hand over fist as a result of this global economic meltdown. And again, we have to remember that this ultimately stems back to what was originally going to be a $700 billion bailout of the global banking system, which at the time still sounded like a mind-boggling figure. And of course, we know that it, of course, quickly inflated into the trillions and trillions that were eventually handed out. But it all came down to that $700 billion bailout, because at that time, they were arguing in Congress about this. And in fact, it was originally actually voted down in the House. And then we saw, the day that it was voted down, we saw this huge, massive dip in the stock market. And it was basically a warning, both implied and very real, from the banksters themselves to the Congress, to say, if you don't give us what we want here, the economy will tank. And that was again not only implicit in the huge dip that we saw in the markets the day that the bailout originally didn't pass, but we also had congressmen come out on the floor of Congress and say that they were actually threatened. They were told in behind the scenes meetings with some of these banking officials that if we do not pass this bailout, there will be martial law on the streets. That was an exact quote from one of the congressmen who spilled the beans about that. So we do know that this was all part of an agenda that definitely kicked in to full gear during the Lehman Brothers collapse, and I really think has been continuing ever since. And there's a lot of people with rose-colored glasses, or at the very least very good liars, who want people to believe that somehow we've come through the worst of that, and now the economy is getting better and unemployment is going down. In the American context, at any rate, that they want you to believe that. But I really do think that this has all been enabled just by the opening up of the floodgates of these trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars. And of course, now with quantitative easing round 3, which is now beginning to taper, and everyone's going crazy about that. Oh, wow, the economy's doing so well these days. Yeah. I really do think we're being set up for an even bigger bursting of the bubble. And unfortunately, I don't like to be Chicken Little running around with a head cut off, crying wolf every few seconds. That's an interesting mix to a fable going on there. But I don't want to be that person who's constantly crowing about the end of the economy and the collapse is nigh. But I really do think a lot of things are converging on the early part of 2014 for a major event. And I have no idea what that event might be. It could take a million different forms. But all I know is that generally in times of great economic crisis, they also love to throw in geopolitically destabilizing events and warfare and all of that. So again, I don't want to be that voice that's just crying wolf, but I really do think that we have to be very very cautious going into this period where I think there is a turnaround and inflection point in the economy that's coming into view. And for myself, it's quite worrying, and unfortunately, I think I have a front row seat to what might be developing here, as Japan, of course, is very much in some dire straits economically speaking, and is probably just going to work itself even further into that hole as they start to implement higher taxes here next year as a way of trying to solve their debt crisis. And I don't think that's going to amount to a hill of beans. But at any rate, I think there's problems going on all around the world, and Ireland probably knows about that better than a lot of other places. So I'm sure I don't have to tell you or your listeners about that.
Well, it's amazing because right now what you're speaking about is exactly what's happening here in Ireland as well, albeit on a slightly smaller scale. But sometimes I feel like Ireland is the testing ground for Europe. It seems to be that way, whether it's certain kinds of charges or taxes or economic troikas entering the country. But our esteemed leader and Prime Minister Taoiseach, to use the Irish word, Enda Kenny, gave an address to the nation, a very fine event that happens in this country very rarely, last Sunday, in which he stated that because we have exited our 3-year bailout programme, everything is rosy in the garden again and people can start building houses yet again, despite the fact that there are 100,000 derelict houses that didn't get finished in this country, and everything's going to be fine, and that the government solved all the problems through taxation, of course, and through austerity measures, which we all know, those of us who have to live through them, do not work, and all they do is inflict more and more pain and misery upon people. So I think we're mirroring what's going on in the grander scheme of things. And you mentioned Japan, because Japan's a very interesting country, not just economically, but we have that great elephant in the room, which the mainstream doesn't like to talk about, and that's Fukushima. And you're on the ground there, so let's talk about Japan for a little while and how things have gone over the last few years, James, and how you think things will go, because I think Fukushima is just this massive incident that has been almost brushed under the carpet, and people don't like to talk about it and don't like to hear about it either. So what's your take on things there?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think Fukushima is not just the elephant in the room, but really kind of this massive thing that Japan as a collective, as a country, has a deep state of denial about. I mean, I think there is a huge anti-nuclear movement here that has asserted itself during the last couple of years and has managed to stage massive rallies. For example, last summer, not 2013, but 2012, there was a series of massive anti-nuclear rallies that were taking place every week and was growing in numbers, anywhere from a few thousand, according to police estimates, to hundreds of thousands, according to the people who were organizing this. And I think the reality was probably somewhere in between, but still, I think tens of thousands of people pouring into the streets of Tokyo, really putting some pressure on the political caste to at least give lip service, which is ultimately what they ended up doing. The prime minister ended up meeting with some of the representatives or people who are calling themselves representatives of this movement, and blah blah blah. And it came to this very interesting point at which the outgoing prime minister last year, he had a panel that was recommending that ultimately Japan scrap nuclear power altogether, goes from 52 nuclear reactors down to 0 over the course of the next few decades, which was a pretty radical suggestion that most people weren't expecting to come from this panel that the prime minister had set up. And believe it or not, they said they were going to start adopting this. And then, of course, that government got voted out, and the new Abe administration came in, and business as usual, and they're going to start back up with the reactors, and they're going to start start them back online. And it seems that all of this has been for nothing. Although, interestingly enough, the Prime Minister's wife has been one of the most outspoken critics of pro-nuclear advocates. So that's another interesting part to add to that mix. But yeah, so it seems that there's definitely a disconnect, a huge disconnect between what's happening politically and economically here versus what the people actually want. And I'm sure, again, that probably doesn't sound too unfamiliar to people in the European Union context. But at any rate, so that's kind of where we are at in terms of the political and economic situation. In terms of Fukushima itself, there was obviously a huge propaganda PR effort to make this as swept under the rug as it possibly could be as quickly as possible. So we saw by the end of 2011, they had declared quote unquote cold shutdown, which meant that they were able to keep the reactors under 100 degrees. They were basically able to keep water in there and keep it from boiling away. So that was success. And from that point, it's just a question of, cleaning everything up and going about our merry way, or so they wanted us to believe. And of course, the last couple of years has shown that wrong time and time again, as new problems continue to arise, even as old problems continue to get worse. Just the amount of water that they're still having to pump through these reactor buildings. As we continue to learn just how badly this situation has been handled from the very beginning. Not only the fact that 3 of the reactors went into complete meltdown within hours of the incident, and they knew about this for certain within days, and then they waited months to tell the public about it, which is just one of the aspects of this that is particularly egregious. But then, of course, the way that they really don't even know where the reactor corium, as they're calling it, the core material actually is lying. They don't know how close it has come to going through containment completely, or if it has actually gone through containment. They're saying it hasn't, but again, pretty much everything that they've said has turned out later to be wrong, or sometimes deliberately mistaken. So again, take their word for what it is. And so again, the process has been a complete shambles. They continue to have record readings of radiation. In fact, an interpolated reading, it wasn't a direct reading, but an interpolated reading of a vent between reactors 1 and 2 just in the last few weeks was 25 sieverts per hour, which is enough to kill a human being within about 20 minutes of exposure. Wow. But no human, of course, was anywhere near that taking any direct measurements. So again, the little bits and tidbits of this keep coming out from the plant from time to time. It's extremely worrying for a number of reasons, but I think the number one reason, of course, is that so much of this radiation keeps leaking out into the Pacific. And in fact, of course, the long-term plan is that eventually TEPCO will be releasing the contaminated water specifically and directly and consciously into the Pacific as part of their long-term plan, simply because there's no way they can possibly contain it all. But don't worry, they'll decontaminate it to safe levels before they release it, or so they're telling us. So again, many reasons to be worried. It's the reason why myself and my family don't eat anything, don't eat seafood anymore, which is obviously a shame, living in a culture in a country where seafood has been so much a part of the staple diet. It hasn't been easy completely eliminating it from our diet, but of course we've done so because I have a 7-month-old son, and I'm not going to basically jeopardize his safety for anything, let alone for the purposes of feeding Fukushima fishermen who continue to persist in catching fish off the coast of Fukushima now. So it's a pretty shambolic situation, and unfortunately, there's a lot of signs that things are not getting better at any acceptable pace. And I guess the other main operation that's taking place right now is the removal of the spent fuel from the spent fuel pool in Reactor 4, which again is a slow, long, delicate process that has the potential to go very, very wrong. So that's something we're keeping a close eye on as well. So I have a website, FukushimaUpdate.com, where we're keeping our eye on all of these developments as they occur.
And I find it very interesting as well to watch the US and North American reaction to Fukushima as well. Aside from the obvious, brushing things under the carpet state of affairs, you spoke about safe levels of radiation, and let's face it, what's a safe level of radiation in our food? But to see the US authorities consistently raise, in response to Fukushima, raise the safe levels, using inverted commas there, very heavily, that is allowed in the food. that to me, I mean, on one particular day, there's a safe level of radiation. Then let's throw a load of radiation into the sea, and all of a sudden we'll raise that safe level of radiation. So what was safe yesterday is now ultra safe, and what was safe tomorrow is not safe today. And it's all just this mishmash and this ridiculous, I think deliberately misleading and deliberately confusing mix of levels and safety and bureaucracy. And ultimately, it's the people who are consuming the seafood and who are being exposed to this radiation who are going to suffer, and they're being lied to, in my opinion. I mean, how can what wasn't safe yesterday be safe today for humans?
Yes, well, unfortunately, there's no lack of examples of that in the United States, in Canada, in Japan as well. There was a scandal that kind of briefly floated through the Japanese media that it didn't really amount to much, but some documents came out, I believe, in perhaps it was March this year. At any rate, it was within the last year or so. Some documents came out that definitively proved that one of the scientific panels that was advising the government here had recommended the raising of the acceptable allowable radiation exposure limits for children in the Fukushima area to something like 25 times what it was before that, for no scientifically valid reason. They didn't have any reason to recommend that, but they did, and it was raised. And when parents kicked up a fuss, they brought it back down to something akin to what it was before. So a lot of this, of course, has been politically motivated from the beginning. And one of the more disturbing aspects of that is that a little-known radiation monitoring system exists in the United States specifically for these types of incidents, for some sort of nuclear crisis where they can monitor radiation levels across the U.S. It's called RadNet, and it just so happened to be down during that very time when Fukushima first was going and was still belching out its radioactive payload out straight into the atmosphere. And as the radioactive plumes were making their way across the Pacific, wouldn't you know it, RadNet was down during that time, so there were no readings available. Again, there's just so many examples of that type of thing happening that anyone who isn't incensed by these things just obviously isn't paying attention.
I couldn't agree more. And there was plenty to incense us over 2013. I mean, from Syria to Boston bombings and beyond. What were the big issues for you, James? And what were the ones that people responded to most on the Corbett report? I suppose, what were the most important things to your mind over 2013? Because 2013, I think, is going to be seen by many people in the future as a year when things were really ramped up in terms of the control system, when we were really prepared for what is possibly to come in the future.
I think you're right about that. There has been a number of inflection points and turning points this year, and some of them, of course, have been particularly dark. I mean, on all sorts of different fronts. We've seen at least major steps towards the normalization of drone technologies, which, again, like any technology, I know that there are good uses that it could be put to, but unfortunately, we're, of course, more familiar with the Predators and Reapers and all of the other instruments of death that are basically video games that people are playing that kill people on the other side of the planet. And we've seen large steps towards the normalization of that, the hardwiring of it into geopolitical relations with what the United States is doing with their drone strikes all around the world, and all of the subtle psychological conditioning that we've seen, including, of course, that big PR PSYOP campaign that Amazon recently came out with their ridiculous story about Amazon delivering by drone, which of course is not something that they're really working on. It doesn't make any logistical sense, but it was a conveniently placed story right there in the middle of a CBS News broadcast just the weekend before Cyber Monday, which is the new big online shopping day in the United States. So wow, how conveniently that worked out for Amazon. But so that's just one of those aspects of some of the I think one of the darker trends that developed this year. And I think another dark trend, of course, one of the major stories of the year, of course, has been the Edward Snowden saga, which, for all of the potential good, I guess, that could come from shining the light on the workings of the panopticon state, or at least exposing this idea to a large part of the public that at any other time would have dismissed it out of hand as conspiracy theory. I think there are dark aspects to this as well, and one of them simply, again, is that conditioning effect. I mean, I see one of the potential outcomes of what's happening right now is that this steady stream of information about the various ways that we're being spied on, which of course is going to culminate in the revelation that, oh yes, the NSA is recording every phone call. They are recording every email. They are storing it right now. This isn't metadata. This isn't any of this tiptoeing around the tulips that they're doing right now. Eventually, I'm sure that this will really be hit home, and it will be made completely apparent. And at that point, if it doesn't change, then it has become the new normal, and people have been normalized to it. Well, of course, everything you do online, every electronic communication is going to be watched. And I see that as one of the darker aspects of what's happening right now, kind of the revelation of the method and the hardwiring of this into people's consciousness. So this is something that, again, I've been talking about for years and years and years on my podcast, not only the various ways that the NSA and other agencies are watching you, but also the effect of knowing that you are being watched, which is something called the panopticon. People can look into this idea. It's an idea for a perfect prison, but it's a philosophical idea, if anything, about the ways that people start to modify their behavior if they think they are being watched at all times. So that's one of the aspects of the whole Snowden saga that I find disturbing. Another aspect, of course, being the ways that we're getting this getting this information, getting these documents. Here we are 6-7 months in, and we have apparently seen, well, some people say 1% of the documents have been released, but I don't think we can even say that with any certainty, because anything from 8,000 to 1.7 million documents have so far been claimed to have been released. So we have no idea what's been released, what hasn't been released, what they're sitting on, what they're not sitting on. And the people who are sitting on this information, the leak keepers themselves, Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, who are apparently the ones who are the only ones who have the full cash from Snowden, or at least that's what they say, are now getting into a $250 million business venture with the co-founder of eBay and the principal of PayPal, which is a company which has been on record saying that they fully support the NSA. So again, it gets crazier the more you delve into this story, and I think there's a lot of dark aspects of this that are going to be playing out in the years ahead. So again, a lot of dark things are happening, but you mentioned a couple of points, a couple of stories that, although they were menacing, I think that there was hopeful or optimistic things that came out of them. For example, you mentioned the Syria debacle that occurred in late August, early September, in the run-up to what looked like a certain military intervention. There was also the Boston Marathon bombing that obviously took headlines, made headlines around the world back in the early part of this year. And in both cases, I think what really emerged from that was the ways in which I think the alternative media has really started to shape the mainstream discourse to an extent that would have been unthinkable even a few years ago. And I point, for example, to Google Trends. If people go there and type in false flag and then search for the past year, they will see that the term false flag, there was an incredible spike in people searching for that term in the wake of the Boston Marathon bombing. And I find that extremely interesting, because it was almost immediately, as soon as that event happened, suddenly there was people all across the board, all across the spectrum, we're suddenly talking about, well, was this a false flag? Could it have been a false flag? Which is almost unthinkable to me, having watched, 6 or 7 years ago when I started to talk about 9/11 Truth. The inevitable first question I would always get from everyone was, why would the government attack itself? Yeah. As if that entire concept was unthinkable to people. I think it has finally been made thinkable, and people now actually have a term for that concept, which is, I think, considerable progress. And we saw that, for example, with the Boston Marathon bombing, although it could have had very real geostrategic, geographical, geopolitical ramifications, it didn't really. That story kind of fizzled out, and all of the potential implications of Chechnya and Dagestan and the war on terror and all of that seemed to fizzle away as people spent more time trying to figure out who was exactly behind this and for what purpose. So I think that was a positive development. And then I think that we really saw that come to fruition in the wake of this the chemical weapons attack in Ghouta in August 21st, and the potential for moving into Syria militarily. Well, people stormed out into the streets. They weren't taking it. There was an incredible amount of people who were saying they didn't believe the Obama administration on this and their faulty intelligence, that it looked exactly like the Iraq war lies, and people just said no. And amazingly enough, they didn't invade. It seemed almost inevitable, but they didn't do it. And so I think there are some positive trends that have started this year, and I certainly hope that we can continue and expand on those successes, because again, I really do think the alternative media has made that possible by laying the groundwork and planting those seeds for people to actually understand the concept that the government lies to the people. And hopefully we can start to expand on that and show people some of the healthy alternatives that we can set up in the wake of the falling apart of the systems that we've known up till this point.
That's a very interesting observation, in particular, well, both on Syria and Boston, because it reminds me of how I heard about the Boston bombings. I remember I was in my car and I wasn't listening to the news or whatever, as I tend not to do when I'm in the car. And I got a text message from a friend of mine basically saying, and this would have been a friend who would have been extremely closed off to a lot of what I would speak about with regard to my own kind of areas of interest in alternative news and stuff. And the text said something along the lines of, well, there's another false flag for you. And I mean, this, even though this would be a guy who would have no interest in looking into whether Boston was a false flag or not, just the fact that he used the words and was aware of them, and it was the first thing that he decided to text to me, I just thought that was that seed that has been planted somewhere in his head that hopefully will spur him to kind of look towards things, or look a little bit below the surface in future when there are these world incidents. The one thing that really did get to me, James, about the Boston bombings was how readily the people of Boston, most of them, seem to accept the army curfew on the streets, and an almost pseudo martial law type situation, which I just thought that was kind of the dark side of it for me, when I saw that, and how people, the government are protecting us now. Protecting us from what? I mean, that's the side of things that where a lot of progress needs to be made. But I do see the rays of hope coming from those incidents, and it's very good that you've brought them up there, because so many people can only see the side of fear and the doom and gloom when it comes to these situations. And I like your perspective on it. I think it's really, really good. So over the next year, what do you think are going to be the big issues to watch out for? Because I always follow with keen interest your, not predictions, that's probably the wrong word, but your observations into the future, because so many of them come to pass. And I like the way you put the information together. It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle. It's not that you're looking to pluck from the ether something that may or may not happen. It's not prophecy. It's quite simply you're looking at what has happened up to now, and it's a trend as opposed to anything else. So what trends do you think will continue and be the big issues over the next year, or even beyond?
Well, actually, it's funny you should bring that up, because as we're speaking, I'm working on my subscriber newsletter that goes out once a week, and I'm working on the editorial. So it's going to be the last one of the year. So I'm working on the look back of 2013 and look forward to 2014. And I did a similar thing at the beginning of the year, and I made some predictions in that newsletter. So I'm going back and kind of evaluating where my predictions came true or not. And actually, I didn't do too badly. Obviously, there were some things in there that didn't come to pass, but I actually specifically said in that editorial last year, I said, I will get the specific events wrong, but the general trends might hold. And I think I didn't do too badly. I was talking, for example, about the economic collapse and things of that nature. And I said specifically that the economy would not collapse in 2013, and that the stock markets would actually counterintuitively start to rise and continue to rise, I should say. So I did actually call that fairly accurately, and some other things as well. But I think you're right. I mean, again, I do not have the crystal ball, and I cannot predict events, but we can see trends, and we do know, unfortunately, where the powers that shouldn't be want to take us. So we can, I think, say with some degree of accuracy some of the things that will be important in the new year. And so I'm thinking about this right now. What should I be writing for my 2014 predictions? I think I'm going to come up with some very, very insanely specific predictions this year, and just almost for a laugh, and see what happens with them. But in terms of the trends, I mean, obviously I might be a bit biased living here in Japan, but I really do think that the Asia-Pacific region in general is becoming more important geopolitically. And specifically, I mean, the Pentagon has, over the past couple of years, made it explicit that they are turning to the Asia-Pacific. They call it the Asia-Pacific pivot, and they are moving more of their resources into this part of the chessboard. And I've been talking about this a bit in my work recently. I really do think that we're seeing the creation of a 21st century Cold War narrative with China, which, I mean, if you were just to look at it on its face, is kind of laughable. I mean, however much China is trying to build up its military and trying to be more threatening, I mean, it's still, if you actually compare it to the American military, it's still absolutely nothing. It's pea shooters versus atom bombs, basically, and it's all going to be smoke and mirrors. I mean, I'm not really, I don't really believe that there's any fundamental rivalry between China and the U.S. and all of that. Because I look at the system from behind the scenes and at the top, and the people who are really controlling this, the oligarchs who have nothing to do with the political positions of puppetry that get paraded before our eyes as if the president of the United States is really the most powerful person in the world. So I think it's all smoke and mirrors. But having said that, they are, I think, trying to set up this narrative of China versus the U.S. in the new Cold War. And I think the Asia-Pacific region is going to become more important in that respect. And we're going to see more events and things happening in this region in the coming years. I'm sure we'll start to see that more explicitly in 2014. And something that I've obviously been keeping my eye on is just the island dispute between China and Japan in the East China Sea, and some of the back and forth that's been going on about that, which again I think is largely political and smokescreen and cover for what's really going on. I mean, what this really is about is an excuse to increase military budgets and do a bit of chest thumping and win elections at home, and I'm sure that will continue into the new year, and we'll probably see things starting to ratchet up with some of the tensions that have arisen recently, like with China's new air defense identification zone that they've just put in place that intersects with some of Japan's claimed air territory and all of this. So we'll see some incidents in that regard, I'm sure. And also just throwing another complete monkey wrench into that works is the North Korea situation and just the bizarreness going on there right now with the Kim Jong-un's uncle being executed, and who knows what's going to happen there. I mean, that's always kind of a wild card in the deck. Looking more broadly, I mean, again, I think economic trends and forces are going to be an important part of the coming year. And I really do think that I think we're being set up for a bubble burst in 2014. I can't say that with any certainty, and I can't say when and how that would start if it does, but I just see that the way that markets are reacting right now is getting more and more detached from reality. And I think that can only happen to a certain extent. At a certain point, when reality touches that bubble, it is going to burst, and it's not going to be pleasant when it does so. So that's something I've definitely got my eye on for the coming year. And actually, I was just talking to James Evan Pilato, at MediaMonarchy.com. I co-host a weekly video series with him, New World Next Week, and we were just talking about 2014, and he came up with a trend for the new year that was positive, so I'll steal that one because I like that idea. Yeah, he was talking about the idea of do-it-yourself as becoming more and more of a trend, something that people are consciously starting to incorporate into their lives, and he said that will be expanding in 2014, and I certainly hope that's true, because again, I think part of the power of this internet revolution that's taking place, if it really is so, is that people can collaborate and share information freely and instantly online, which can create the kind of communities of knowledge and experience and expertise where we can share information directly. We can bypass the systems that have held us in place for so long in so many different respects, economically, in terms of food production, in terms of so many different aspects of our lives. We can start to bypass the institutional grid that's been created around us. So I certainly hope that people will be taking more advantage of this and expanding into the new year with this idea that we can do it, if not ourselves, we can collaborate actively and share information and form communities that will maintain and cohere throughout whatever turmoil or crap the powers that shouldn't be want to throw at us in the new year. So I hope that's a positive trend that will be developing into 2014.
And I think there is plenty of crap they are going to throw at us. But overall, long term, are you broadly speaking positive, negative, or what way do you think things are? I mean, what's your gut feeling as opposed to looking at any of the specifics? What is your gut feeling for this group that we call humanity on this planet at the moment?
Well, I guess this is the half full, half empty question, optimistic, pessimistic. And my answer is that if I wasn't optimistic, if I didn't have hope that there was a chance that we could change this, that we could change things around and make for an actually truly better world for future generations, then I wouldn't be here talking to you right now on a Friday night. I would be probably inebriating myself and watching sports or something like that, just to pass the time until I die, curled up in a fetal position in the corner. But I'm not doing that. I am using the chance that I have at this point in time to try to spread this awareness and this information, because I do believe that humanity can and will thrive into the future, and that we will survive, that we will rid ourselves of this kleptocratic, pathocratic, psychopathic overclass that has kept us down for generations untold. And I really do think that we can turn it around. And I'm under no delusions that that's going to be an easy process or an inevitable one. Certainly, we could lose, and humanity really could be Orwell's nightmare vision of a boot stamping on the face of humanity for the rest of eternity. But as long as we have a chance to make that not become a reality, I'm going to be doing everything that I possibly can to make that, to change that and to make it into something good and better, and to hopefully throw off this oppressive class that has been really ruling over us for far too long.
Well, that's really what I like to hear. And I think there's one little thing that the powers that shouldn't be often overlook, and that's something called the human spirit. And that doesn't go away. And no matter how many boots are stamping on humanity in general, I think that spirit is always there. And I think that's the big fear for a lot of them in power, because that's not going to go away, in my opinion. I think that's why, well, I suppose the forces of good versus evil will ultimately triumph, in my opinion. Before we let you go, James, you mentioned very briefly some insanely accurate predictions. Can you give us one of them?
Not insanely accurate, insanely specific. Well, one of them that I'm going to probably put in there is I'm going to predict North Korea's collapse this year.
Wow.
Why not?
That's
in the coming year, sometime North Korea will collapse. And I think let's just use that as a thought experiment. If that happened, what would be the ramifications of that? Because obviously you'd have millions upon millions of refugees who'd probably be trying to flood over into China, and China would definitely not want that. I think they're economically unstable enough as it is. And yet, of course, they wouldn't want the U.S. or U.S.-affiliated allies to come in there to try to stabilize the situation, because obviously then they'd be right at China's doorstep. And I think China would not allow for that. So what would be the resolution to that? I'm going to try to puzzle through that. So those are the types of thought experiments that, again, even if they do not come true, they are interesting and they can tell us a lot about the world we're living in.
Give us the websites, because I know there will be many people who'd like to check out more.
Yes, well, the main website is corbettreport.com, and I'm affiliated with a lot of other websites, the International Forecaster, Boiling Frogs Post, Global Research. I have FukushimaUpdate.com. I have a lot of different people that I interview and partners with and that type of thing. But basically, corbettreport.com is the one-stop shop. People can find all of my information there, 100% freely available to download thousands and thousands of hours of media in the archives there. And I hope that people will use it as an information resource, because that's what it's been built up to be.
And for those who missed it, people can find that link on the Alchemy Radio website. Before you go, James, just a little suggestion for you. I think your mixed metaphors and your Chicken Little analogy was fantastic. I think you should maybe think of writing a children's book. There's something in there somewhere. I think fair play.
I've never been told I should write a children's book before, but that's intriguing enough a suggestion that I might actually contemplate it. So thank you for that.
Well, no problem, James. It's been fantastic having you on Alchemy Radio. If you're amenable to it, we'd certainly love to have you back on a couple more times in 2014. I think you've a refreshing take on the global situation and what's going on in the world, and it's very articulately put, and we certainly appreciate it here. So thank you very much for your time, and have a great 2014.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, and I certainly wish all the best for you and all the audience out there. Again, it's not all gloom and doom, and sometimes I think we just all need to unplug and spend time with our families and remember what it is that we're fighting for in the first place. So that's what I'm going to be doing for the next couple of weeks. So to everyone out there across the planet that's doing the same thing, I salute you and what all you guys are out there are doing to help spread this word. So all the best to you and yours during this holiday season.
I have the power, you have the power, we have the power. James Corbett, thank you for joining me on Alchemy Radio today.
Alchemy Radio.